We're going to look at the Pacific theater, the Pacific part of World War II, right? There's a European theater, there's an African theater, there's a Pacific theater, and the African and European theaters kind of merged together, but the Pacific theater is pretty much a separate deal by itself. So we can treat it separately from what's going on in Europe and North Africa. If we look at the map here, we want to remember Japan right up here is a large island, and that's one of its problems. It doesn't have a lot of natural resources, doesn't have oil wells, coal mines, iron ore, steel mills, doesn't have a lot of those things that it needs. It doesn't have agriculture to feed itself. So way back in the early 30s, Japan starts moving into these areas, Manchuria, northern part of China, and Mongolia. As early as 1931, Japan is invading those areas. It's also going to take over Korea. By 1937, Japan is launching major invasion into Manchuria and Mongolia. This is long before any fighting started with the United States, with Germany, Italy, France, England. The war really started in some ways with Japan attacking Korea, Manchuria, China, and Mongolia. So that's how things get started. Japan is expanding into this area. It wants the natural resources there. Again, oil, coal, iron, steel, agricultural products, food to eat, all the rest of that. Japan has a vision of taking over pretty much the whole edge of the Pacific. It wants to conquer and occupy all of this and have that as its sort of personal private possession. Where the whole thing takes a turn in the wrong direction for everybody, and you know this, December 7th, 1941, Sunday morning, surprise attack on the American naval ships parked in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. That brings the U.S. into it. Now, it was a surprise attack, but the fact that we ended up in a war with the Japanese was not a complete surprise. People kind of saw this coming. There was a lot of tension between the two nations. So here's where it starts, but we kind of knew it was coming sooner or later. We didn't know it would be here. We didn't know it would be that day, but we knew sooner or later we'd be fighting the Japanese. All right, so America gets socked at Pearl Harbor. At nearly the same time, coordinated attacks. The Japanese attack Wake Island, the island of Guam. All right, so this is their expansion eastward. All right, they had been hugging the edge of the Pacific here, but now they're moving this way. They're trying to keep the United States from slowing down their expansion. Well, these orange lines here on the map show the Japanese aggression, where they're going. The territories marked in orange were things they eventually occupied during the war. The United States is going to come back. All right, so here's Pearl Harbor launching here and coming this way. So we have Battle of Midway in 42. We're going to go island hopping, they called it, because the Pacific, all these little islands, you show up with your army on boats and you take them over one by one by one, and you keep hopping from island to island, pushing back toward Japan. So eventually the U.S. is going to keep putting pressure on the Japanese. Now it is an alliance. We have Australia down here, which is of course part of the British Empire. So we are going to have British forces as well involved in this, helping us out. We're not going to see much involvement by Germans or Russians or French in the Pacific. So it's mainly the Japanese, the Americans, and the British Empire at work here. Airplanes are going to be a huge part of this, as they were in the European theater. Airplanes are changing the way wars are fought, so we have aircraft carriers that carry a lot of airplanes. Those airplanes will meet the enemy airplanes high in the skies and shoot at each other. We're also going to have some bombing raids on Japan, and eventually it's going to be continued bombing of Japan that's going to begin to crush the Japanese infrastructure and begin to trim their ability to fight. All right, so the U.S. is going to move this way and take back all of the territory that the Japanese had occupied, had invaded, and by late 1945, Japan is encircled around its own territory. It's had to give up all these things. They've been liberated. And as we know, in August of 1945, the war finally ends after the 2 atomic bombs are dropped. The 2 atomic bombs dropped in 1945 in August. While they were a major development, the fact of the matter was the island of Japan had been under continuous bombing with traditional bombs for several months, and those bombs were actually much more destructive in total because thousands and thousands of them were dropped. So the atomic bomb was a sort of a icing on the cake. It was the thing that sealed the deal, but it was conventional bombs that had been leveling the major cities of places like Tokyo and the outlying islands around Japan. So the war in the Pacific ends August of 45. The fighting in the Pacific for the average ordinary soldier was much more brutal than it was in Europe. The Japanese were not at all reluctant to torture people and would capture American and British soldiers as well as local soldiers from places like the Philippines and torture them mercilessly. American soldiers would much rather be captured by the Italian army or the German army. They knew as a prisoner of war they would be treated much better. If you were captured by the Japanese, you would likely be tortured and you'd likely die in captivity. You would not be treated well. The Japanese were also merciless to the civilian populations. All these areas that they conquered, they came in, they would routinely kill dozens and dozens of local people in each village. Many of the women were sexually assaulted. Many of the children were taken as slaves. So the Pacific War was actually a much more horrendous and horrifying event than the European War. But by August 1945, it's over, and we will end up with the United States Army occupying Japan and the southern half of the Korean Peninsula, which is how we ended up with South Korea and North Korea in modern times. But that's another story for another day.